let's introduce Emily. We're so delighted to welcome Emily Feng back to Duke. Emily is an award-winning international correspondent for NPR, covering China, covering the U.S., Taiwan, and beyond. And I will read also what Ralph wrote. Feng's reporting has let her nerd out over semiconductors and drones, travel to environmental wastelands, and write about girl bands and art. She's filed stories from the bottom of a coal mine, the top of a mosque in Qinghai, and inside a cave Chairman Mao once lived in. Formerly based in Beijing and Taipei, she now lives in Washington, D.C. I think importantly, and we're really delighted to have Emily back because she is a 2015 graduate of Duke, and she double majored in public policy in the Sanford School, as well as in Asian and Middle Eastern studies. I know Ralph is not feeling so great, but he, as a very responsible introducer, has actually written a script. So I will just, I will cosplay Ralph. How's that? Yeah. So this is not me. This is Ralph. To have the sexy gravel voice, right? But I had the joy and privilege to be Emily's instructor in my migrant China class now more than a decade ago, and I was a reader for a very large ethnographic and public policy thesis she wrote on the challenges facing non-official schools for migrant children in Beijing and Shanghai. I remember right after graduation, she sent me a piece, one of the first forays into her journalistic writing, published in HuffPost on the margins, migrant education in Beijing. I would highly recommend everyone to Google and read this piece.
Oh no, I didn't remember writing this.
It not only captures extraordinary research she did on these quasi-illegal migrant schools, but also reveals her incredible storytelling skills about difficult topics, something she has never shied away from, right? Now, back when Emily first went off to Beijing to begin her reporting career in 2016, she used to write an email newsletter, and Ralph shares some a passage. She says from 2016, "A few weeks ago, when I sat down to write the first part of this newsletter, I found it difficult to begin writing. The blank page, usually an invitation to confession, felt incriminatingly empty this time. I went on a run to clear my head and to think about what I wanted to write about, to condense all the many thoughts I had swirling around in my head over the past few weeks. Yet despite how sharp the winter air in Beijing has become, my thoughts remained indistinct. An hour of dodging bikes and small dogs around the Forbidden City, and I had to confront the inevitable conclusion of my jog. My life over the last month was normal. Nothing big had happened. Nothing had changed. I clocked into each day, clocked out, ate dinner, slept. Then I did it again. Is this a hallmark of life as an adult? When it begins to pass by on a scale of months and years rather than days and weeks, I'm beginning to understand why adults sometimes have nothing to say to each other at dinner parties." So, I might, kind of skip ahead a little bit. And as Ralph says, while the pace of Emily's life may have slowed in these autumn months in Beijing, Emily's career was about to take off. In late 2016, she was a writer for the New York Times. By January 2017, she would become the Beijing correspondent for the Financial Times, where she worked for the next 2 years. But I think it was really in later, when I remember in October 2016, one morning, I remember waking up to Emily's voice. Or maybe this was just a story of hers I had read on the NPR website. But I've heard her voice telling stories about China so many times that my memory has convinced me I was hearing her voice. She was talking about the feminist activist Ye Haiyan, also known as Hooligan Sparrow, who was the subject of a new documentary by my good friend Wang Nanfu, which actually screened at full frame here in Durham, about her efforts to gain justice for 6 schoolgirls who had allegedly been sexually assaulted by their principal. Emily would go on for the next few years to continue to write and talk to us about stories of struggle, injustice, unthinking violence, of women's issues, ethnic minority issues, but also stories about aspiration, of the brilliance and smart of people she was meeting in China, of longing, identity, and belonging in a country that has not only changed so remarkably in the last 3 decades, but even more proudly since Emily showed up in Beijing in 2016. Through her writing and reporting, she has brought the beauty and complexity of so many people and lives to us every week. And now she has brought these amazing stories and her storytelling skills, as well as her empathy, compassion, and always searching philosophical mind to her greatest accomplishment yet, her book, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, Identity and Belonging in Xi Jinping's China. So this is all Ralph. Please join me in welcoming back to Duke our very own Emily Feng. Did I do a good Ralph?
Thank you for those beautiful words, Ralph, and for reminding me of the words that I wrote so long ago.
So, I guess I should put on the Eileen hat now and say that thank you, Ralph. Those are such beautiful words, and also sharing Emily's probably very early writings that I had never heard. So today, I'm so thrilled. I want to say happy book birthday, just because it was just earlier this week. And if you know me well, you know I do birthday month. So really, this whole month is happy birthday to this book. And it's really a wonderful achievement. And I think that before we even start a conversation, Emily and I were talking earlier, and I really encouraged her to read us a little bit of it to give you a sense of the texture of her voice and the kinds of stories that she tells in this wonderful book.
So we've selected a passage from right in the middle of the book. And to give some context, this is a book about online discourse, and the main character is a guy who goes viral for stealing scooters and then becomes an internet star unexpectedly. So this is a passage about after basically getting obsessed with this guy for months and months and stalking him online, finally getting to meet him at a restaurant that he started in southern China. We found him on our second night in Guangxi. He was holed up in his upstairs office. To our surprise, he seemed to be in the middle of entertaining about a dozen police officers. His trademark long hair and t-shirt stood out among the dark uniforms and crew cut surrounding him. Joe, his name was Joe, ushered us out into the hallway looking harried. Owen, my then producer, and I were a little starstruck. He was a little thinner and sallower than the Joe from his original 2012 viral video, but here was the spiritual leader of the slackers in the flesh. He was also looking much less relaxed tonight. Shutting his office door behind him, he explained to us that a group of police had surprised him with a health inspection. Additional security officers had called him earlier that morning, warning him that 2 journalists from Beijing would try to interview him, and he was to refuse at all costs. Embarrassed he could not be a more hospitable host, he offered to treat us to dinner downstairs, where his intoxicated older brother, the spitting image of Joe, but shorter, tried to lighten the mood with a drinking game. Soon, 3 pairs of men filed into the restaurant, conspicuously ordering fruit juice rather than the crates of beer the bare-chested clientele around us were throwing back. They acted more like plainclothes police, I realized. Flustered, I accidentally ordered rooster testicles for the hot pot. So that was what male chicken eggs were. We hastily left after seeing one of the men filming us with a handheld camera disguised as a phone charger. Back in Beijing, I wrote up a trip for a news piece on NPR, filed away my notes, and moved on to other stories.
So this is but one of many amazing, amazing stories. I was telling Emily earlier that it's, the reporting is meticulous. And some of it echoes, some of the news stories that, Ralph alluded to and that we've read over the years. You've been really one of the strongest voices covering China in the last decade. And so I appreciate also seeing that kind of meticulous, news coverage. And also combined with maybe, to use an old school metaphor, maybe like Studs Terkel's oral histories, that you give people a kind of latitude and amplitude to speak. So you hear their voices, like Joe the scooter thief was one of my faves. And the way that you can really hear him. You can really hear him not only through his conversation, but also through his affect, even through his body, the way you describe him. I think in the best form of kind of long-form journalism, you have that Chinese term 起承转合, but you have a really wonderful kind of rhythm that, both, the beginning and the rise and then the volta, right, the turn and a kind of conclusion. But as I was mentioning to you earlier, one thing that fascinates me is that you're actually quite novelistic. It's
a huge compliment.
Yeah, most of your stories, in fact, so she has many short chapters in this book, and some are linked chapters. So some stories and people kind of cross several chapters, like Kenny's story or Yusuf's story or whatnot. But what is fascinating to me is Emily doesn't tend to wrap up her chapters the way you might imagine, I think, a journalist piece to wrap up, but you end novelistically. You have this kind of almost quiet, or sometimes a holding back, right? That, and we are almost a little bit looking past the corner, looking around the corner to say, well, so what happens next? What happens to him? And I wondered, just out of curiosity, like how much of that curiosity do you carry with you today? I mean, what happened to these people? All these stories that you write about, where are they now? Are you in touch with any of your subjects?
I'm in touch with most of them. And to be honest, a lot of them have left China since I wrote the book. So that's why, not because I wrote the book, but just because of the way the momentum in their lives were taking them. It's also partially why I was able to include them in the book. Some of them are now in the US. Some of them are living in Taiwan still. Some of them, one of the main characters is in Southeast Asia. And I spent years talking to them until I was finally actually able to meet him in Kuala Lumpur. So it's been this multi-country reporting experience. Even though this is mostly about China, it did take me all the way from Kazakhstan to Malaysia. And then the book ends finally in the US. And unfortunately, a lot of these people are not planning on going back to China anytime soon. But one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book was because I wanted to be able to track people longitudinally. And I love this about audio. It lets you hear directly from the characters who are going through these experiences and whose lives reflect the stories that I want to tell through news pieces. But it's so hard to get at the emotional inner world of a lot of these people. And for some reason, we have a wealth of that from other countries that are not English speaking. I think there's amazing reporting that comes out of the Arabic speaking world, from the world of Russian literature and people who are still based in Moscow. But for whatever reason, we don't have that about Chinese speaking people from China. And part of that is it's really hard to report there now. We have fewer foreign reporters who can live there full time. There's an amazing Chinese journalism ecosystem out there that's unfortunately been, for both financial and political reasons, pretty much decimated. And so I felt like I had this wonderful experience, maybe a little bit too short, on the ground in China. And I wanted to give readers like a sense of what it felt like to be there and what it felt like to be those people, because that's ultimately like the act of empathy that I wanted to create in the writing.
And I think you achieved that marvelously. I mean, so through your writing, through your sense of reporting, and I think fairly unstinting. You don't actually hold back from also showing the ways in which maybe the stories they tell contradict themselves, right? That you also point out the hypocrisies or the kinds of reversals of thinking. And one of the things I like most about all these stories, and it reflects maybe the decade that you spent covering China and sort of in the area, is that you actually give us a really longitudinal sense of China in the last decade and a half, right? So you often begin actually before you were there. So you often begin with talking about the liberalism of the 90s, or maybe even earlier, like, for example, the scooter thief himself, right? And that he goes viral because he's repeatedly arrested for petty theft, for stealing scooters. And he lets out this famous line, right? Or saying, well, what can I do? This is what I do. And, it's hard to make a living. And then, but it's interesting that the video shot in 2012, you point out, he doesn't go viral till 2015, right?
When he's still in jail.
When he's still in jail, when that moment of 内卷 and, of involution and of Tangping, of lying flat, suddenly seems like something that he becomes an unlikely anti-hero, right? But then you also mentioned, this is kind of heart of a lot of your discussion, that it's a contradiction of Xi Jinping's, is it to tell a story well, or is it to tell the good China story, right? That, his, in some ways, dictum of saying that we should all now tell the China story well and tell positive Chinese stories, like the Zhen Liang stories. But David Wong has written a book about this, but it's also but there's also to tell the good China story, right? And I wondered, as a journalist and also as the author of this book, how did you balance that? Did you recognize that, do you always think about the formal narrative of the good China story? And were you in some ways having to tell a counter narrative, when you encountered good China stories?
I think the whole premise of this book is to expand, like, what is the story of China? What is China? I mean, China as a nation state is a pretty new entity. I think that these boundaries are not always historical. They have historical reasons, but they've been changing over the centuries and even millennia. And so I wanted to highlight the inherent diversity and dynamism of people in China, both from a political standpoint, but also cultural, linguistic, from a gender perspective as well. And I don't want to set myself in contrast to the good China story, because I think there are so many good China stories out there. But certainly I think that, and I talk a little bit about this in my book, as I was reporting the stories in China, and especially as the COVID pandemic really shut things down in the country, even though we were able to still travel quite a bit domestically, this narrative of wanting to tell the China story well from authorities did become much more present in the official reaction to my reporting, even when I felt like I was telling quite positive stories about China, highlighting the fact that there is, and still was and still is, enormous cultural dynamism in this country because of just how different people are, and that they're still creating new things and operating in gray spaces. But according to some people's definition, that was negative. But what I really wanted to get at in this book is, like, being Chinese and what China could be means many, many different things to people within the country, outside of the country, and actually a lot of the discussion about what is Chinese culture and understanding Chinese identity and history is now happening outside the borders of the People's Republic of China. And part of the book was also written unexpectedly in Taiwan, where I moved in early 2023. I had unexpectedly not been able to return back to Beijing, where I'd been living for 7 years. And that, in a way, freed me up to write the book. I had sold this book idea and then thought, I probably shouldn't write this while I'm finishing up my posting in China. But writing it in Taiwan also gave me a totally different perspective on the book. And I kind of end there as well.
So, I find that fascinating. And, we were talking earlier that one of the things about coverage in the last several years, I mean, one is a little increasing shutdown of ability to report in China, but also because of this exodus to Taiwan, that Taiwan now has become increasingly a subject of coverage. Even the cute stories, the boba tea stories, the dumpling stories, suddenly Taiwan is the material and source. And you did some wonderful coverage in Taiwan too. So I was wondering, can you speak a little bit more about that, sort of writing in Taiwan about, and in fact, the book, I mean, I think before you went there, you were already covering, because you were covering Hong Kong, you were covering, dissidents from Hong Kong to Taiwan, for example. But how did the actual writing in the physical space of Taiwan, while you're reporting on Taiwan stories, shape the contours of your writing?
Well, first of all, I was just so much less stressed in Taiwan that I had the mental space to sit down and really think about writing long form. So that was great. But also, I think because Taiwan is both, for obvious reasons, really, really interested in what's happening in China, and there are many people who have family ties in China, there is a mainstream discussion of current events and identity. What is Chinese identity? Taiwan itself is constantly having this conversation about what is Taiwanese identity. And having that physical distance from China, while also being quite proximate, both mentally and geographically, let me take a step back and think about how I'd been so caught up in reporting on China and traveling basically every week, but finally able to have some distance and think, how is the rest of the world approaching this question of what's happening in China and what Chinese identity means? And unfortunately, when I moved there, I think Taiwan was really getting into thornier and more substantive conversations about how to counter the potential threat from China. And they were also getting more people who were trying to move to Taiwan from China. Again, they were seeing this resurgence in Chinese political refugees, basically, and migrants who were coming from either the mainland or Hong Kong. And it had sparked this more mainstream discussion about what role Taiwan wanted to play in this conversation about China's role in the world. And also, what is the identity of these Chinese-speaking people who are coming to Taiwan, which is a Mandarin-speaking society, and whether Taiwan wanted to be open to that. So it provided another really interesting foil to think about identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you do it very, very sensitively, and you talk about, really one of the ways that there's a kind of fantasy, as you say, from the 70s of sort of hijacking a plane and going to Taiwan. but then recognizing that maybe in the
would actually happen many
times, and then in the 90s and then in the 2000s. But then after a while, people were just like, no, go home. We don't want you. Stop hijacking planes, right? So, but you show that really the changes not just in maybe Chinese mentalities or the people who are hijacking, but you show the way that a kind of mainstream discourse, whether official or popular, is also, constantly in flux. And similarly, even in the Hong Kong coverage you do, the initial wave, the incredible sympathy towards folks involved in 2019 coming Taiwan, but then also a kind of resistance. And as you point out, Taiwan doesn't have formal asylum laws. So I wondered if you want to talk a little bit about, like, say, Kenny or some of these Hong Kong, or also a Chinese protest, it's hard to call them dissident, but at least live streamer, that, where did they find themselves, caught?
So some background on these stories. As the book goes along, some of the characters start running into one another and bumping into one another in the same spaces, even if they start out in very, very different places and chapters. And so I profile one of these Hong Kong protesters who becomes a frontline protester, gets arrested, ends up skipping his trial, becoming a fugitive in Hong Kong. And he decides, after several months of living in hiding and the national security law coming into effect, that he's got to escape this place. And so he gets on a boat, a fishing boat, with four other, mostly teenagers, and they try to make their way across the sea to Taiwan, where they think they're going to be welcomed with open arms. And there they find themselves smack dab in this debate about, do we even want these people? Are they a security threat to Taiwan? How Taiwanese can they become? And they occupy the same milieu as this Chinese student who I ended up following for the last 4 or 5 years, who had tried to become a political refugee in Taiwan, but finds himself still stuck to this day without official papers because he is from the PRC. And there is a huge amount of suspicion about his purpose in Taiwan, whether he deserves to stay there, and how Taiwanese he can truly become. And so through these two stories of both what's happening in Hong Kong and also how that collides with events that are happening in mainland China and discourse in Taiwan, illuminating both some of the social prejudices that existed in Taiwan at the time, and also the strange contortions that political boundaries and immigration have to fit themselves in because of the unique histories of these places. So an example of this is the fact that Taiwan does not have a formal asylum law. And a big reason for that is because so many of these asylum seekers were coming from mainland China. Technically, in Taiwan's eyes, in the Republic of China's eyes, Republic of Taiwan, Taiwan, mainland China is part of the Republic of China. So you can't accept political refugees from a territory that you consider part of your own territory. This is also one of the reasons why it's been very, very difficult legally for Taiwan to make legal space for Hong Kong asylum seekers, because they also see Hong Kong as part of the Republic of China, Taiwan. And so you have this strange legalese happening as well, complicating these people's asylum cases on top of these bigger conversations about what role does Taiwan want to play in the Mandarin-speaking world.
And I think that I mentioned that each of your stories has a really wonderful narrative rhythm and and kind of trajectory, but the whole book does too, because you begin with a lot of stories that you tell us about people you met and covered, people who lived in Zhengzhou, people who lived in Henan, but you also end up talking about people from Mongolia and Xinjiang. And as you say in the beginning, a kind of the China story from the sea point of view, Chinese identity is increasingly defined as Han-centric, heterosexual, male and heterosexual, and telling a certain kind of positive story. And so I felt that it was really lovely the way that you kind of moved us through all these different, I don't want to say center periphery, right? But rather, like you say, the possibilities of hearing different kinds of voices and stories. And one of the through lines is actually about language and dialect. So would love, so So I hope I don't put you on the spot by saying you're Chinese American, you're Asian American, you learn Chinese as a second language, right? Your family is actually more Wu dialect, right?
Yes,
I think
but
you mentioned
they never taught me
they never taught you
the Wu dialect.
So love to hear like what was your kind of sense of that, you know, did you feel like you belonged in a kind of capacious definition of Chinese identity, or did it actually make you feel more outside of it, right? By reporting on, you know, all these people telling China stories, like, did it actually affirm your Americanness in some way, right? By being, or did it actually say, wait, no, I'm actually part of the story too?
It's been an ongoing journey.
Right.
I think when I first moved there, it was for sure this curiosity about my own family ancestry. And I felt reaffirmed in my decision to move there because of just how fun I found reporting on China was. And I hope that people get a sense of that in the stories. Like, maybe if you're just listening or watching to coverage about China these days, it seems like this big, scary, homogenous place, and it's all about politics and whatever. And I was really hoping in this book that people would read it and be like, wow, they're really interesting people in China, and they have really cool lives, and they care about things that we care about, and they're relatable. And I wanted to convey some of that excitement and love that I have for this place in the book. So when I moved there, I think I fell completely in love with this country that I didn't expect to at all. I had moved there purely because I spoke Mandarin. I could read a little bit of it, and I felt like that would be the best place where I could get a journalism job, to be honest, because it was so hard to get one here, and still is. But I found myself like totally in love with the subject material because of the unexpected diversity in the stories that I found there. And so very much felt like, you know what, this could be a place that I could live for a long time. Unbeknownst to me, the year that I moved there was 2015, and it was the week after something called the 705 crackdown. There were hundreds, about almost 400 human rights lawyers that were suddenly arrested across China. And it was really basically the beginning of Xi Jinping kind of showing his political vision for the country. He'd been head of the party at that point for about almost a year and a half. And so it was kind of the beginning of the tone and atmosphere for the rest of my reporting stint in China. I just didn't know it at the time. And so I went there with no expectations, found myself identifying really, really strongly with the country, and then trying to immerse myself as quickly as possible. But in the process of becoming a journalist, of learning more about the country, realizing that the things that had drawn me to China were also some of the things that were being, unfortunately, controlled more and more, and ostracized more and more. And during the pandemic, as there were fewer foreign journalists remaining in China, I found myself on the target end of pretty frequent online trolling campaigns and online hate campaigns and state media articles that specifically talked about my identity as a Chinese American reporter working for US media and casting my coverage as somehow a betrayal of that heritage. Whereas I had gone into this project feeling that in exploring these stories about China, that I was doing that in part because I really identified more and more as fully a Chinese American, not just as an American. So that was a really alienating and heartbreaking experience. And then finally in 2022, I had to move to Taiwan, and it ended up being a really, really lovely experience that made me better as a journalist. But it was a very hard process to not be able to return to my home for the last 7 years and to suddenly have to move to Taiwan and think about how to cover this country that I had invested so much time and effort in from outside of that country. And the book begins with me thinking about that question, like, how do I cover China if one day I'm no longer able to actually report on the ground there, which is what all the trend lines were pointing to even back in 2019. And that's when the roots of this book began. But it was getting to Taiwan that then introduced me to this idea of like being in touch with Chinese culture, with this idea of the diaspora that was not necessarily within the PRC, not necessarily even in Taiwan. I did so much more Southeast Asia travel and coverage when I was in Taiwan and started connecting more with these discourses that were happening with Asian Americans, or sorry, not Asian Americans, but diaspora Chinese who were living in Europe and North America. And it was there that I found another way to connect with that side of my identity and my reporting as well. And just found it to be so much more welcoming and flexible in terms of family background and political belief. And I think in Taiwan was where I found some peace with it and found a way to re-identify with my Chinese background again.
I mean, that
ironically,
that's wonderful. And actually, it's kind of, I think you've already answered it, but so the question I was going to ask you is really, what were the advantages or disadvantages of being you in this self, right? Like, a Chinese American woman, but as you say, sometimes it was your strength and sometimes it made you a target in a way that, somebody else in a different kind of visible identity was not. But it does raise the question also being a woman journalist. I think some of the most powerful stories out of China the last many years, but also that you've covered and also stories in your book, like The Chained Woman, are really about that really complex space of gender and especially of feminism, of young women, from one-child policy to multi-child policy, from LGBTQ being not exhorted but kind of tolerated to suddenly crack down, all these things that you saw. But as a woman reporter, as a woman writer, what did you make of all this that you witnessed or that you were writing about?
This conversation was just beginning as I was leaving China, because I think the effects of the 3-child policy were just starting to be felt.
Right.
In 2022, the campaigns to get people to have more children and the maternal care subsidies and the lengthening of maternal, what's the word? Like maternal, the time you're able to take off if you have a baby with a more maternal leave, were becoming much, much more generous. So it's been interesting to watch it from afar. And I think it's changed quite a bit in the 3 years that I've been away. I think that China is one of those unique places where Western foreign correspondents have primarily there's been a more equal gender balance in the kinds of reporters that have gone to China. It's been pretty equally split, I have to say, over the last couple of decades since China opened up politically to allowing foreign journalists to be stationed there permanently. It's been pretty equally split between men and women. And I think that's partially because it was physically quite safe to report there as a woman. And that's not the case in a place like India or even parts of Africa or depending on where and which topic, the Middle East. So and this was, I appreciate this about China. You get this amazing vantage point where you're able to travel very, very freely as a woman and see these issues firsthand without feeling nervous about your safety.
So something that Emily and I were talking about, because I asked her, what is it like being back in the US and back in DC? And I was telling her that my friend Mike Forsyth and also Mary Kay Magstad, so some maybe a generation ahead of you in terms of foreign correspondence.
Mary Kay opened up the NPR bureau in Beijing.
Yeah. So
in the 1990s.
And they have all said to me that the best U.S. political correspondents are foreign correspondents because they are able to see the U.S. in a global context. And I know that, because Emily was saying she had finished this book and now it's coming out, and maybe there's anxiety that who wants to hear about China? We're like, hellfire and brimstone every 30 minutes, right? But my sense when I was reading this, and of course, as I said, some of these stories I'd heard from, your earlier reporting, right? They were actually more poignant now. They felt more universal now. Because when I'm reading about shutting down of websites, when I hear about shutting down NGOs, when I hear about a kind of slightly capricious decision about what was considered okay business practice and suddenly incredibly to be jailed business practice, or even the scooter thief himself, right? That he goes from kind of a TikTok star and then he's kind of warned that he should tell the good China story. So he should make like positive, happy stories about being law abiding. But then that story doesn't land for him either, right? That gets him in trouble too. Like, is he being sarcastic? And he's losing his original fans too. But when I'm reading this now, in this moment, it's hard not to think about DC. It's hard not to think about this moment that we find ourselves in. So when now you're kind of back in DC, also covering the federal government, do you bring that foreign correspondent, angle or insight into your work?
Absolutely. It's part of the reason why I think NPR brought me back here. I did a piece, I think it was last week, about how basically China watchers are increasingly using their political science skill set of analyzing factional Chinese power politics to understand American politics these days. There's been a lot of other people writing of parallels between Chinese modern politics and American politics. I think that another great reason why foreign correspondents make for good is we're kind of used to just working around the clock because of time differences and distance, like travel and everything. And so you get here and people are like clocking out at 5 p.m. and you're like, I'm just getting started. Let's call it 9. Yeah, it's given me a lot of context to compare to other things that I've seen and other political trends in countries, not just China, but also I see things happening in Eastern Europe and and understanding that what's happening in the US is important. It's also not the only thing that's happening. So that also kind of gives me pause when people feel like things are terrible. Well, there are terrible things happening around the world and putting that in context. But also sometimes understanding where they come from and knowing that also this is a bit of a marathon, not a sprint. Yeah, covering the American story.
I mean, I think that you see that, and that's why I feel like your stories are very, drill down deep into these people's lives and these stories in China and in the larger diaspora, but yet they have this kind of new relevance and new, they expand our global perspective, right? And so I really think, I hope lots of people read it, not just people who are interested in China. I also think it's interesting to, I was saying to another crowd recently that having not grown up in the US, I do find that sometimes in this moment, and this includes me being a good liberal and progressive in this moment in the US, is that you get a little too caught up in the fantasy of democracy. And a global perspective does kind of remind you that maybe Americans, and maybe especially the last several decades, have really inured us to danger and to violence. Like we kind of assume those things don't really happen. And so I love that your kind of global perspective takes away a little bit of that illusion. And I know that right after, recently you've been covering Syria and the Middle East for a bit of time. So what was that like, between China, Taiwan, and DC, you also had this other assignment. So,
well, the great thing about NPR is we're big enough to cover the world. We have this research, but we're also small enough that sometimes when crap really hits the fan, they kind of throw anyone able and willing at a certain issue. So for that reason, I've been able to spend time in Ukraine. I did a 2-month stint in the Middle East between moving from Taiwan to the US. And first of all, it was the first time being in Syria, the Levantine area in general was the first time in like 3 years that I didn't miss China, because it was so darn fun to be in the Middle East. It reminded me of why I love being a foreign correspondent. There were so many elements of reporting in those places that reminded me of why I loved being on the road in China. Just kind of this feeling that it was honestly not very dangerous in Syria when I was there, or Lebanon. I went after the ceasefire with Israel. But so you could go everywhere and just kind of be on the open road. We didn't really step off. There were landmines, but like stay on the roads, and people were just so good at telling their own stories, and things are so complicated, and there's so much history, and there's so much identity politics. I mean, basically the exact same thing as China. It just so happened to be in a different region of the world with a different history and different dynamics. So it was a great refresher. I found so many parallels with what reporting in China is like, but also it reminded me of the different ways that people tell their stories. So a big challenge in this book was getting people to open up emotionally. Like I wanted to understand not just what happened, but how did they feel when that thing happened to them? And that took a lot of prompting. It took a lot of emotional tooth pulling. Whereas in Lebanon and Syria, I'm sure this was not like this during the Assad regime in Syria, but people were so willing and so capable of self-narrativizing their own stories. It almost felt too easy, even though I didn't speak any Arabic. I don't want to say that I was an amazing correspondent there. I'm not a Middle East correspondent. I don't really speak any Arabic. But even the ability to speak directly to people in China still made it a harder place to report in some ways if you really wanted to drill down into who a person was there than in the Middle East.
Right. I think, given that, Ralph and also Bob and some of your former teachers, and since so many people in the audience I see are also students, I have to pivot a little bit to your Duke past. Also, you're wearing Duke blue, so intentionally, right? I submitted my bracket. I put Duke Finnoir, and so really curious about what was your college training like? What kinds of things interested you when you were undergraduate at Duke? How do you go into journalism? How did you end up going in this direction?
I think I had a bit of an unconventional path. I went to journalism because, as that newsletter that Ralph unearthed suggests, I like variety. I'm curious. I get bored super easily, and I was struggling to find a career that fit that rhythm. I was considering academia, but then I realized I don't have the attention span to write something for even months at a time. Sometimes I get a little bit bored. And so journalism just kind of presented itself. And I got so lucky with the time window because I moved to China at a time when it was still possible to freelance a little bit, and it was easier to get a visa. And so outlets were willing to sponsor visa applications that would still at that time take months, but at this point they take years to get. And so I kind of just slid right under the door of that period of openness. But at Duke, I studied public policy. I studied Asian and Middle Eastern studies. I was not part of the Chronicle. I wrote for them every so often, but I was not a journalism student. I was certainly very, very journalism interested. I took Bob Bleiweis's magazine writing class, and I thought to myself, maybe I'll be a novelist because I love fiction. I love writing. I like prose, no matter what it's about. It turns out writing fiction is really, really hard. And not many people do it well. And I realized that through literary journalism, that actually what happens in the real world is in some ways just as cinematic and just as interesting as things that you imagine. And so I decided to start writing about real people and real events. And that's when I started to think about a career in journalism. I was considering moving to Myanmar at the time of graduation. They had just had their first elections a few years before. Aung San Suu Kyi was the president. Things seemed like they were opening up, and it was like the perfect moment to get in there at the beginning of a country that was beginning to turn another corner. Of course, now we know that did not happen. There was a military coup, and there's still a terrible civil war going on there. But I did travel to Myanmar shortly before graduation. Kind of got a sense that things were a bit dicey there, and decided maybe I'll go to Beijing instead. And so it was really just like feeling around in the dark and liking the process and falling in love with the process of journalism that made me a writer and a journalist. But it was not necessarily the profession itself. It was the way that I wanted to understand and interact with the world.
And I'm also really curious about your almost seemingly seamless transition from print journalist to also audio journalist. And so I wondered what you think is different about doing print work and doing audio work.
I still have to do a little bit of both. Sometimes for a big radio story, I'll write a text story. They reach different audiences, but the writing style is super different. The flow of storytelling is different. It turns out that we consume information differently through our ears than when we see it on the page. So a really obvious and easy one is in newspaper journalism, they always talk about the lead and the nut graph. You want to have your thesis statement right at the top because people are reading top to bottom. But in radio, people tend to listen to the end and they remember what they hear last more than how the piece began. And so if you do have any kind of parting message you want to give to the listener, I tend to put it at the end rather than the beginning. There are also stories that I feel like I've done for audio that just would never have worked for print because it was purely the sound itself that drew people into the story, not so much the story itself or even the facts presented, but just because it was a bit of an audio portal for a listener to enter and travel to a different time and place that they might not necessarily go to themselves. So I loved the process, but it's been, it's actually not as hard as people think. I really recommend that people try out audio if they're interested in multimedia. It's technically much less demanding than video. But I just had to consume as much audio as possible. And over the years have really enjoyed this process of learning how to use sound in different ways.
That's fabulous. I know that I have a million other questions, but I also know that the audience probably has questions for you. So I'd rather that we open up and maybe take some questions I highly recommend this book, and maybe I should end by saying, as a literature teacher, of course, my highest praise would be to say that this reads like literature, that this is novelistic, and lives up to maybe Emily Dickinson's notion of tell the truth but tell it slant. That there is this really wonderful way that not only, like I mentioned, pacing and suspense and all the ways that you give us a kind of novelistic interest, but I think the your attention to these people as humans, as characters and as humans, really keep us dwelling. So I keep on thinking about them, right? I keep on thinking about them, not only in the sense that, oh, this is a real event happening or that has happened, but rather that they are such vivid characters. And so they still live with me and they still make me think about them. And so it's just a wonderful achievement. And finally, as I mentioned, it's scarily relevant. So if you read it now, you're really also, it's a really good way to think about this moment that we're in, maybe in a provincial sense in the US, but rather in a longer durée of thinking about global things. Maybe one final thing I love about Emily's book is that, Professor Jameson, who just passed, but, his famous exhortation is always historicize. And I do feel like this book is you say you're not an academic, but this is a lovely piece of historicization, that you constantly always gesture to the historical context and the ways that things move. And one of the things that sometimes journalism is a little facile, or sometimes when you hear like a certain media reporting of another country, is that they want to pin it down like a butterfly in a particular moment. And I feel like every one of Emily's vignettes and stories always guide us backwards and forwards from not just that pin butterfly moment, but rather in the context of a larger history. And that's just really an achievement.
Thank you.
But so, let's open the floor to questions and comments. And I see Prasenjit, I see Kanan. Yeah. And please introduce yourself or let Emily know who you are.
It's on. I'm Prasenjit Dwara. I'm also director of APSI and very happy to have you here. And I just wanted to get your personal view, though it could be comparative or not, of why Xi Jinping moved in the direction that he did. And you were there from the beginning till when it was no longer possible. What is your view?
I write about this a little bit in the book, this obsession with, and this deep anxiety about the party falling apart. He comes out with these internal speeches around the time that the Communist Party of China is about to reach the age of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union right before it disintegrated, essentially. And he has these anxieties about how to keep it together in the face of these basically ahistorical challenges that China is now facing. And I think one of the big conundrums, if you study him as a person, is he was terribly, he and his family have suffered terribly under modern political history, especially during the Cultural Revolution. His father went through terrible, terrible trials. There's a new amazing book coming out this summer by Joseph Chirigian about Xi's father and all of the trials and tribulations that he went through and how he got through them. But this father really passed on this history of trauma and suffering to his own son, who, instead of turning against the party, realized in his mind that he began to interpret these traumas that he and his family suffered as mistakes that the party made in governing itself. And so to make sure that these tragedies did not happen again, the governance system of the party itself had to be perfected and strengthened. And so instead of reforming the party itself, the party needed to be strengthened and part of everyday life. And so I think that's why Xi Jinping has become more of the hardline ruler that he's become. He's thinking about how to embed the party more into everyday life, how to make the party run more efficiently. I mean, he's an engineer by training, as most communist leaders of his stature are. So to run it almost as a scientific governance mechanism, because individual humans are not able to understand a country as large and as complex as China. So you need a bureaucratic structure that can kind of respond almost autonomously to facts on the ground and then funnel that information up to a central leader like him. And I think also he's become, as a result, very, very interested in national security. And I argue that identity is a huge part of his concerns about national security, that understanding what your people think and also being able to guide how they think and how they conceptualize themselves as a people, as a nation, is really, really important for a country that a civilization that historically has been as fractious as the Chinese Empire. So he needs to fortify identity as well. That was also one of the reasons why the Soviet Union split. It was a union of many, many different republics who were quite literally, basically different countries. They exist as various, republics and countries today. So he looks to history, and he also looks to these ongoing conversations about Chinese Empire and trying to unify the Chinese Empire, and has taken a much more top-down approach in response.
And Kanan, Professor Morse.
My name is Kanan. I'm an academic and a translator. Of the million questions that I do have, just maybe one. There is a history and a canon of books on China by longtime U.S. foreign correspondents. What do you want your book to do to that canon? Where do you want it to be? What do you want it to push against?
That's a great question. Also, I love that. I don't know how many books fall into that canon. It's a very specific genre of book, but I have read every single one of them. I really, really respect books like Factory Girls by Leslie Chang, which Ralph Litzinger has taught in his classes. I loved Age of Ambition by Evan Osnos. One of my favorite books written by an American journalist is Out of Mao's Shadow by Philip Pan. I've devoured every single one of Peter Hessler's books, including his most recent one. And there's a bunch of new books that have come out just in the last 2 years from many of my cohort who just left China in the last couple of years that are a little bit more politics centered, but also very, very good. One about House of Huawei by Eva Doe of the Washington Post, a former colleague of mine, Yuan Yang, who is now an MP in Parliament in the UK, who wrote one about women and their status and upward mobility in China that also was really, really beautifully written. But I hadn't seen one that was about identity. And ultimately, these were all the stories that I loved reporting the most on the ground in China for NPR and for other outlets. And it was the one that I realized I felt most strongly about because actually it ended up being personal. So I resisted for so long not putting the first person voice into the book. My publisher pushed against that, and she was right. And so this is still mostly a book of reportage, but it ended up also being a bit about my journey as a reporter in China as well. And I saw it in terms of where we are in the story of China. I saw Philip Pan in his book, Out of Mao's Shadow, which came out in 2007, 2008, like right before the Beijing Summer Olympics happened, as the peak of China optimism in terms of journalism books about China. So that entire book is about how China is coming out of this communist overhang on history and how people are reinventing ways to live and how to be Chinese and what they think the future of their country is going to be out of Mao's shadow. Then you have Evan Osnos' Age of Ambition, which comes maybe like 6 or 7 years later. And it's the peak of China as an economic story. So you have people who are incredibly ambitious. You see kind of the idealism of Phil's book, Out of Mao's Shadow, disappearing, but people accepting some of the trade-offs that come in terms of personal liberties or quality of life because they feel like as long as they work hard, they can still reach their China dream, whatever that dream might be, and the China that Evan covered. And so I saw my book as kind of like the end of that trilogy of books of what has happened to all of that optimism and economic momentum. And it's become less about how to develop China or China becoming more of a global player coming out on the world stage, but looking more inwards and becoming really, really obsessed with ideas of identity, of national security, about how to shore up the country from within, for better or worse. A lot of their thinking has been incredibly strategic and long-term. And ultimately, I came back to instead of telling the stories, this story through politics or leaders or policies, I always try to go from the outside in. So just finding the most unconventional characters whose lives I still think reflect these bigger trends. But narratively, in terms of where I feel like it fits in with this genre, I see it as maybe like the end of this little compact trilogy of the last 20 years of China.
That's fabulous. I see Nicole.
Yeah.
Professor Morning. Yeah.
I'm Nicole Barnes, and I teach 20th century Chinese history here. So I can think of a lot of questions to ask you, but I hope it's not too uncomfortable. I'd like to turn away from China or even the book and to you. Because as I am hearing these stories of what you did as an incredibly young woman, just brand new Duke grad, kind of intrepidly going out into the world, I see a woman with a great amount of self-confidence. And so I'm a college professor. I sometimes have the perspective that I maybe believe in my students more than they believe in themselves. Obviously, Duke is very much on helping young people be very big. And I also assume that a lot of that self-confidence came from your family and your upbringing. But if you could think back on your time in college, were there formative moments, people who had a big impact on you that helped you believe in yourself that much? Because it's truly extraordinary what you have done. And I can't wait to just continue following you and see what else you do in your life.
So I feel deeply uncomfortable receiving very nice compliments like that because maybe it comes off as confidence. I think it's a lot of imposter syndrome. And I think it's a lot of what drives me, honestly, is curiosity and the fear of being bored. So there are so many things that I'm scared of. If you knew me as a child, I mean, like, I was afraid of water. I was afraid of biking on two wheels. I was afraid of the dark. I was afraid of sleeping. Like, I was afraid of so many things. I'm still afraid of so many things, but I have a stronger fear of being bored. So that's what drove a lot of my travels and my reporting. A lot of the people who were deeply impactful in my time at Duke are actually here in this room. So I see my professor, Guo Jun, who's my advisor for my AIMS class, Ralph, who introduced me a lot to just studying China and realizing that could be something that was intellectually interesting. I discovered long-form writing and magazine writing in Bob Bleiweiss's class. So Duke made me realize that the world is really, really big. I'd grown up in a tiny town of 5,000 people in rural Connecticut. And although my parents came from another country, from China, and it was a very safe place to grow up, it was really only after I got to Duke that I realized there's a lot out there. And I was more scared of missing that than of all the other things that I'm scared of. You know, I'm a very anxious person. People think I'm a great traveler. I am very experienced, but I'm a nervous traveler. So I have to push myself to do these things every day. I'm not blasé about it.
I learned to ride a bike in Beijing. So I understand the fear, but also, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Rohan Wang. I'm a first-year grad student at Duke, at AIMS. And thank you for your talk, and thank you so much for your efforts to tell these stories that might otherwise remain invisible or trivialized or ineffable in an inward gaze. I'm especially touched by the chapter you talk about the chained woman. It's an incident that I followed from its beginning to its unresolved ending. And felt deeply powerless at this point. And I noticed that in your chapter, you also include Chinese women who decided to go to USA, to go to California, and to give birth to their children there. And your ending was one of the women decided to name their baby Sapame, the name that claimed to be the name of the chained woman, which for me somehow feels more ironic and than sympathetic. And I'm also thinking about how the same year, 2022, is also when the federal constitutional right to abortion was eliminated in America. And I think my question is, I wonder, how do you deal with the common tendency to situate America as an idealized other in writing the Chinese stories?
That's fabulous.
I initially did not have a chapter about gender at all in the book, but it was my friends. I was still in China at the time when the chained woman happened. It was my Chinese friends around me and their reaction to the ongoing story of the chained woman. We still don't really know who she is, if she is the person that authorities claim her to be. The initial woman in the video still hasn't really been publicly seen since as well. It was my friend's reaction to that ongoing story and just how deeply it disturbed them, particularly if they were women. I mean, I remember one friend of mine had to go to therapy because she was so deeply disturbed by the story of the chained woman, realizing that there were many, many other women who had been trafficked like her, and was disturbed by the lack of response to this video in China, that I decided to write about it. Like, there was something there about how viscerally people were disgusted and horrified, to a level that, I mean, I was horrified, but not to that level. There was a whole reason, a history of suffering that shaped people's reaction to the chained woman story in China to that. And that was why I wanted to write that chapter. And I note that, as what Eileen said, I think a lot of these stories are becoming more relevant and maybe resonate more with readers in the US today, as the US goes through its various political changes. And I didn't make this story, this book, a book about the US-China relationship. That certainly creeps in towards the later chapters as I start talking about the Chinese diaspora in the US and how they navigate that geopolitical relationship. But I didn't want to make it a comparison of this happens in China and this is what it's like in the US. But I do think you still sense in some of the characters in that book this idealization of the US and an unconscious contrast between that woman who decides to name her daughter after Xiao Huamei. And I mean, she idolizes the US, and that's why she decides to come here and have her children here. And I'd be curious actually to follow up with her. I still have her WeChat about what she thinks now. She's had 2 of her children now in the US, and whether she thinks that she still wants to stay here. Because when I talked to her, she was still thinking about moving back to China after zero COVID ended. But yeah, it's...
And also, like, her case is in fact one of the Trumpian executive order discussions about birthright citizenship, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in some ways, that's the kind of almost the negative example of, this is how it's being manipulated or exploited from the point of view of people who want to do away with birthright citizenship. So it's really kind of fast. It would be really curious
to follow up with her. And listen, I don't make any moral judgments about these people. I did a whole story about surrogacy and essentially people having their children, trying to birth their children here in the US because they want US citizenship for their children. And I'm fascinated by it, not because I have an opinion on whether this is right or wrong or good for the US or bad for the US, but because I'm just fascinated by how people behave in response to external stimuli. I mean, this I don't think would be, I'm just like fascinated by the ways that the two countries, the US and China, are so intertwined, to the point where people who are Chinese citizens are having American children. And I just find that outgrowth so interesting.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Raven. I'm a PhD student at Duke in genetics and genomics, and I have a question that's not academic, but somewhat related to the last question. So I'm somebody who was born and raised in China, and then I moved to the US for my studies. And I was wondering, from your perspective as somebody who was born and raised in the US, and then you spent time in China so recently, and you were able to observe Chinese people, and you have these characters in your book. A question I think about a lot is whether Chinese and American people have different values, or I guess a better question would be how values are shaped by your upbringing, whether you are in the US or in America, and how that, and maybe that is, there's also influence there from your cultural background, not just where you grew up. So some examples of that, I think, would be the value of, say, the pursuit of happiness, the value of a person, the value of a woman, for example, in particular. I felt that I had to learn a lot of these things after coming to the US. I remember working with my therapist and learning that, like, for example, it is okay to pursue, say, happiness, maybe even over achievements you would be able to obtain academically or career-wise. I was wondering, from your observations as somebody who had like an American Chinese upbringing, and then you were able to spend time in China so recently, do you observe these kind of value differences between the different countries, whether it's in the characters you decided to follow or just people you've observed in your time? Like, is that actually something you notice? Like, what are your observations on people's differences in the ways they, like, their values and how they think of themselves?
Both countries are so big that I think you can find a little bit of everything. And not coincidentally, there's a much wider social discourse happening post-COVID in China about what is the purpose of existence. And this like work hard and achieve your ambitions narrative in the boom years of China, I think is on the decline as more and more people start thinking about, well, what really makes me happy and what is the right balance of work and life and family that I want. Because evidence to the contrary from the last couple of years, even if I work really hard, all of that could be taken away from me in an instant. So I actually don't think that I found the people in China and the US very different. You could always find someone who is an exception to the rule and who was carving out their own space in China in ways that I found resonated with me very deeply as an American. Perhaps it's because I'm already Chinese American, and so I imbibe a little bit of both. But I'm here in the US, and I feel like the two countries and have a lot to talk about that are very, very similar on the cultural and political level than the ways that they're different.
I agree, really. Sorry. Yeah, and then someone in the back. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Felipe. I'm a third-year student from DKU, Duke Kunshan University. And first off, I want to thank you. Second off, my question is two-pronged. As a person living in China, I try to keep up, and my Chinese isn't as good as to read in Chinese language content. And I was wondering if you have any recommendations for good journalism that's being done in China by people who live there and experience it firsthand. And then secondly, there's been an increase in Chinese journalism going abroad, especially in the global south, and they do, in a way, control the narrative and how these citizens from the global south see China. I wondered if you can comment on that a bit.
So one outlet that I actually listen to more than I read is Initium, which is one of these diaspora platforms that is mostly doing long-form journalism in Mandarin. And they also have a really great news podcast, which is modeled a lot after the New York Times Daily, and that's entirely in Mandarin Chinese. So they talk about Chinese news, they talk about global politics, they talk about American politics, but from the angle of what would a Mandarin-speaking audience be interested in. So I really like that perspective, and it's also just a really great way to listen and also read Chinese. And because the content they cover is truly international, it can be interesting to like listen to an NPR report and then listen to how Initium does the same report or a report about a very similar topic. So I recommend Initium. Regarding Chinese media going out, like how effective they've been? Is there like a specific?
The list of state-owned department is how much the comment and how much the editorial independence is.
I think where you've seen this the most is television in Africa, and this is really a standards issue. So in terms of like people actually voluntarily of their own initiative picking up a copy of China Daily or clicking into a Chinese state media website that's in English, I still don't think that happens very frequently because, frankly speaking, I have to read this stuff every day, and it's actually not very interesting because there's not a lot of room even for the English language version anymore of publications to write more colorfully. So it's hard to organically create that interest outside of China when even the English language versions of state media have to be pretty tightly controlled. But in Africa, because so many of the television infrastructure and satellite infrastructure out there has been built by Chinese state companies. A lot of televisions, for example, or mobile phones that are made in China and sold in Africa come preset with apps and channels that are from CCTV or from Chinese news. And so just through that kind of standard setting that the US, frankly, has been so good at in the past decades, that China is now trying to emulate, by default, you're getting devices that are tuned to or programmed with Chinese state media. And so it's less that people are interested in this stuff. It's just that it's accessible and it's there. And it's been a very, very smart move of China to pull together both the infrastructure standard setting push that it's made in the global south and to also inject a media element to that.
I was going to also add, especially for language learning, a very vibrant space in Chinese media informal Chinese media is actually podcasting. It's less censored. You talk about Koaija and Gushi FM quite a bit, and but it's just that they have huge listenerships, and yet they're not as kind of controlled. And so I think that might be a really great space to explore in terms of reporting as well.
So, two very loosely related questions, feeding off the most recent question. Voice of America, does it have any resonance now that it's been declared dead and gone? Has it had resonance with the Chinese listening public, and will its loss be felt? And then, ever so loosely related, maybe since we just heard a question from Sean, colleague, and I remember, Emily, back in the day, you and I would have some conversations about that very thoroughly experiments. You have a take, I'm sure you have a take. What would it be on Chinese higher education vis-a-vis, let's say until very recently, the state of American higher?
Okay. Like the quality of it?
Right, the quality. So, yeah, right. The quality, the lasting impact.
So it's hard to overstate just how important Voice of America has been for Chinese listeners and listeners in China. And this is true of the other government broadcasters like Radio Free Europe, or, Voice of America also did stuff in like Farsi, and, they had huge listenership in these places. And I just did a story for NPR last week, or was it this week? Don't remember. Maybe this week, about the legacy of VOA in China. It's one of those platforms that basically everyone above a certain age, before smartphones took off, basically, has a memory of listening to in China, whether secretly or during a pivotal...
So in Taiwan?
Yes, through shortwave radio, during a pivotal political moment in the Chinese-speaking world. Even in the 50s and 60s, I had stories of people who were secretly listening to this stuff when it was punishable by detention. There have even been stories of people who have been executed for listening to VOA, but it was just seen as such an important news source that was uncensored by the Chinese government and brought real news, both good and bad, about the world, about the US, about China, into China, that people still tuned in. And over the decades, as China opened up and more people listened to it because they wanted to learn English, that was a huge tool for American public diplomacy, because people started learning to speak in the language that we here in the US engage with them primarily in still. There are not so many people learning Mandarin Chinese, but there are a lot of people learning English in China and coming to the US and engaging in international diplomacy in our language, which I think is just so important. So it's been an incalculable loss that VOA has had to shut down its broadcasts because of essentially funding issues. Yeah, I mean, I hope they're litigating that, actually, because it's a little murky about whether the president can do that. But it's been a huge part of Chinese history. And so I did a piece, I think it was this week, about just how VOA has chronicled that for people in China, but also it's been, as a journalist, something that I consult. It's how I understand China, not exclusively. I look at other information sources, but it's platforms like VOA and RFA, which was started after 1989. It's a little bit newer, that document China to a level of detail that Western outlets like NPR don't. And of course, there is a mission behind RFA and VOA, but they were a window into China just as much as they were a window to the rest of the world for people in China. And they were incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. I mean, I felt like growing up in Taiwan, I mean, this is how you learn English. This is how you really, in so many ways. Yeah, ICRT.
Still around.
I know. That's how I learned English, really. And so, but let's take one last question, and then we should let you sign some books and do things like that. So maybe in the back over there.
Hi, I'm David Liu, affiliate scholar at the Franklin Humanities Institute here, and I run an independent laboratory called Mangroves on translocal planetary futures. I want to get back to your mention of the issue of Chinese identity and how it seems to be driving a lot of policy directions, and it seems that beneath that surface is quite a bit of anxiety, right? The anxiety of figuring out what it means to be Chinese and what it means to be a Chinese nation. Now, that's of course not unique to China. We have our own anxiety about being American here. I have some notion of what that entails, but I would love to hear your perspective on the what should we say, the whispers, the demons, and the sprites driving this complex anxiety.
I mentioned a little bit about Xi Jinping's preoccupation with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which he felt came down to no one believing in the Soviet project anymore and knowing being man enough, in his words, to resist the splintering of that project. And that came in part with this idea of identity, of affiliation with a shared revolutionary cause, which he's tried to keep alive. I think that China has been this ongoing project. It's been a project of many emperors, of many modern political leaders. So it's no exception that Xi Jinping is thinking about this. And as I mentioned in the book, every country, every new nation state thinks about how to create a common identity and how flexible and elastic you want that identity to be. And I think that China has moved in the direction of being as inflexible as possible, because the idea has been, in order to govern a country as complex and large as China, rather than create a more capacious identity, it is safer, maybe more labor intensive because it requires more enforcement. It is safer to create one that's much more narrow. And I think there is more and more, I noticed more and more of a preoccupation in policy to try to influence how people think about things in China, not just what they do. And it was this concern with the interior world of people in China and the way that the party state was concerning itself with that, with things like inculcating core socialist values, or with trying to shape family dynamics in light of the 3-child policy, or to get people increasingly now behind this new economic vision for China to support new productive forces and invest in cutting-edge technologies, even if in the short term it might lead to a recession, but that we should, aim for getting through these tough seas ahead because we're in this like global geopolitical battle against external forces not seen before in history. All of these slogans now that are out there in Chinese state media and in policymaking, I felt if there was a theme that tied them all together, it was about ultimately how Chinese people should think of themselves and see their role in the bigger Chinese building project. And I try to make the argument in the book that seeps into every aspect of identity and how people live. So how you conceptualize gender, what your vision for how the economy should run is, of course, what your role as a political citizen in the Chinese nation state is, and how that influences its foreign relations with the US and also with its regional neighbors, and why it acted the way that it did in Hong Kong in protests that arguably had happened many, many times before in that city-state. Why react so strongly this time around? And I think there is, to me, this really, really interesting notion that identity is security, that by creating a strong identity, you also create a strong nation. And I hadn't seen that I hadn't seen that in previous Chinese leaders. It's been at the forefront of Xi Jinping's China.
So with that, let's join me in thanking and welcoming Emily.
Thanks so much.